the Atlantic Ocean, while at the same time being only about maybe 15 minutes away from Delaware Bay. After high school, I went up into the Army as an intelligence analyst for a while. When I got out, I moved to New York City and worked as a project manager for a construction company, until I met my wife and decided to move back to New Jersey to be closer to our family since she was pregnant with our daughter. That's just some background on me. So, this happened in October of 2018. It was about 11:45 at night, and I decided to go on my front steps to smoke a couple of cigarettes before I tried to fall asleep. Everyone in the house was already sleeping. It was a pretty clear night, without many clouds in the sky, but there was some fog on the ground. And as I was smoking, I was looking at the fog, and to me it looked like there was sort of movement in it. I know it sounds crazy, but it was almost like there was an invisible sort of camouflaged thing out there that I wouldn't be able to see if it wasn't for the fog hanging on the ground. As I was looking at the fog, I noticed this white truck that had driven by 2 times at this point. I could hear a woman and a man yelling at each other when the truck stops at the stop sign in front of my house, and the woman gets out screaming at the man, then slams the door as he pulls off fast, then proceeds to walk into the woods across the street from me, which is really weird because there isn't really anything back there except for like blue holes until you hit the bay. If I walk out my front door and just keep walking straight, there won't be any houses or civilization at all, only trees and like artificial lakes, blue holes, left over from sand plants until you hit the Delaware Bay. So at this point, it's been about 5 minutes since the woman walked into the woods when things started going from weird to just unbelievably scary, strange, and the most reality-shattering thing that has ever happened to me. So I'm still looking at the movement that I'm seeing in the fog when I hear this very loud noise come from the woods that sounded a bit like metal being ripped apart. There really isn't a good example that I can give for that sound because it was just so unearthly. I'm sure that it wasn't a natural sound though. That sound lasted for probably about 10 to 15 seconds, then abruptly stopped, and was replaced with a different sound, which I can feel more than I can hear, to be honest. What I mean is, imagine being aware that there's a huge sound happening by you, but it's out of the frequency that your ears can hear. That's the best way that I can describe it. But this sound, though, is constant through the rest of the experience, and this is the point where I will probably lose some people, and I'm aware of how crazy this all sounds, but as I'm getting adjusted to the sound, it sort of feels like something reaches out to me mentally in my own head, but does so without words, and only conveys a feeling of like calm and a heads up or warning for what's about to happen. It kind of felt like whatever it was feeling me out to see how I would react to what I was currently experiencing, like a security check or something. Anyway, as I was having this feeling of calm conveyed to me, I noticed a light in the sky that seemed to have risen out of the woods, I would say about 5 or 6 miles away from me. At this point, it's only a ball of light in the distance, but I just knew that it was coming right towards me, although it wasn't moving very fast. Right after I noticed the light in the sky is when I start to get really, really freaked out, more than I've ever been. In the woods across the street from me, which is no more than 50 yards, all of these orbs of light just start to appear. I could see some which seemed to flicker into existence. These orbs were all white light, which didn't light up the area around them like you would expect from flashlights or something. There were probably about 12, maybe 16 of them, which moved in a totally smooth manner. Besides the trail to get into the woods, the area is so dense and infested with sticker thorn bushes, it simply wouldn't be possible for people to move where the lights were moving, let alone do it completely smoothly. I really am positive that they weren't people with flashlights too, because of the area and the characteristics of the light orbs themselves. In any case, I'm just watching the orbs move around for about a minute, trying to make sense of what I'm actually seeing here, when I look back up to the sky to see a craft coming practically right towards me, with it only being about 1,000 yards away at this point. So I'm sort of going back and forth looking at the orbs on the ground and the craft, which I start to make out better. It was flying very, very low, and I would say it was only about maybe 3.5 to 4 stories off the ground at this point. I see the path that it's taking and see that it's going to pass right in front of me at an angle in which I'll be able to see underneath the craft and the side of it at the same time. The craft was a single story, sort of dull black rectangle. I could see underneath the craft and saw that the rectangle was made up of 3 smaller sort of rectangle panels that fit together to form a larger rectangle. I clearly saw that the craft was made up of 3 panels though. The size is harder to estimate, but I would say that it was about 35 yards long and 20 yards across. Underneath, there were lights flashing in a pattern which would cycle through, then cycle back the other way. In the moment, I thought that the craft was signaling to the orbs on the ground. It didn't make any sound at all, mind you, and all I was hearing is that same sort of buzzing or humming noise that I felt more than I heard. But while it was in front of me, though, it was moving really slow, to the point where I don't think a plane with a normal propulsion system could even stay in the air at that speed. I take my eyes off the craft and look back down at the orbs, which are still moving all around, though one was starting to cross the street in front of me. I only took my eyes off the craft for a moment, too, when I looked at the orbs, but when I looked back, the craft was just gone. For whatever reason, when I saw the craft vanish like that too, the reality of what I was seeing really hit home, and I got scared, to be honest. Since my daughter, wife, and mum were all no more than 50 feet away from all of this craziness, I just went inside and I locked the doors. I just felt like I would have been willing to investigate more if it was just my life I was playing with, but I wasn't willing to take that chance with my family's lives. Now, I'll admit that I could have been just paranoid at this point, but I honestly felt like I was being watched for like the next 2 hours. Mind you, I didn't seem to have any lost time from this event, and the entire thing happened only over a period of like 20 to 30 minutes. But looking back on it all now, I question what exactly was going on with the white truck and the woman who walked into the woods at the beginning of this story. I've also done some research and found that there are a good number of reports of people seeing a sort of glimmer man in the woods, which made me think of the movement that I was seeing in the fog. Where I live too is a very active area for UFO phenomenon, which makes sense if something wanted to have access to major cities like Philadelphia, New York, Baltimore, and DC. I mean, what possibly could be a better place to hide than almost inaccessible 1,000 feet deep lakes in the middle of the woods, right? Anyway, I know that this is a bit of a long story, but I wanted to be as detailed as I could. I would really like to hear what all of you guys think about this, though, and if anybody has had a similar experience or know somebody who has, well, I would really love to hear from you. Anyway, thanks for listening to me, and it feels good to finally get this off my chest. So, I just had my baby in April of this year, and he's my first. He's also my world. In February, though, I was around 7 months, and finally I was starting to show. I was a late shower, so the 7-month mark was finally the point where you could say with certainty that I was pregnant if you saw me passing. I live in Arizona as well, so it doesn't get too cold here, and I was wearing a tight sweater that showed off my bump. I was super proud of it. Anyway, I was at a Walmart after work, I think, just picking up a couple of groceries, and I was approached by a lone woman. She was a little shorter than me and had brown hair, and looked around 35 if I had to guess. She seemed normal enough and sweet. She struck up conversation with me about my bump and typical how far along are you, and I can tell that it's a boy by the way that you're carrying, and stuff like that. Again, she was sweet, but she also lingered a little bit too long. I can't think of a reason for this in that particular moment, but the woman gave me a super weird vibe. I let her know that I had to get home to make dinner, and then she asked me for my information. She said that she owned a children's boutique and would love to meet up to give me clothes for the baby or something. This seemed odd for several reasons. But why, as the owner of a children's boutique, would you just give away your merchandise to a stranger that you just met? I politely declined, though, and when she asked to take my phone number down in case I changed my mind, something inside me was just screaming to not give it to her. I let her know that I really was not interested and went to the checkout. For some reason after that interaction, I felt super unnerved, and as I walked out, I looked behind me. She was leaving the store as well. I had already started walking to my car, but it was dark and I was parked far away, so I began to walk faster. I parked far because I had heard walking was good for pregnant ladies, but in that moment, man, I was regretting making that decision. To my relief, she walked to the passenger side of a car in the same row as mine, and I still had a ways to go. I didn't see her get in or anything, but I was relieved nonetheless. When I finally got to my car, I suddenly got the intense urge to lock it as soon as I closed my door. And I am thankful every day that I did, because a millisecond later, the woman sprinted up to my car, violently tried to open the passenger door, and when it didn't open, she banged on the window shouting expletives at me and then sprinted away. I was scared out of my mind, and I peeled out as soon as possible. I didn't even see where exactly she went, but I never went to that location again. Now, I'm not sure what would have happened if I had gone to meet her, or if I didn't lock my car doors right away. I'm not sure what she wanted, but I have heard stories about women who steal babies out of pregnant women's bodies, and I fear that may have been what she was trying to do. I don't know, I don't even like to think about it, to be honest. But I'm telling my story here because I want to make sure that all of you guys stay alert and cautious if strangers, regardless of if they seem normal or even nice, approach you and act like she did. So when I was around maybe 4 or 5, I was getting tucked in for the night, and there was this closet to my right. It was one of those sliding closet doors and could be opened effortlessly. And after my parents went to bed, I closed my eyes and attempted to start drifting off. After around, I would say, maybe 5 minutes, I begin hearing a rattling to my right, and I jolt up. Now, I believed I was awake, and I would soon be proven wrong, I suppose, but I got up out of my sheets in my dream, stood up, went over to my closet, and when I did, the noise stopped. For a second I thought, maybe I should just go back to sleep, but I was determined to find out what this noise in my closet was. I've never been one of those kids that there's a monster in the closet type, but after this, I definitely looked at my closet differently. I sort of slowly began to open the closet door, and about halfway through fully opening it, a loud screech screamed back and forth through my left and right ear, alternatively, quickly. I quickly covered my ears in sort of a knee-jerk reaction, I suppose, and then the ringing stopped. I looked up and saw what I can only describe as like 2 flickering red eyes floating there, slowly fading in and out of existence. After a second of sitting there, barely holding back tears, thanks to adrenaline, and everything seeming to have stopped, I was suddenly shoved to my bed by an unknown force, and it began to wrap the blankets around me so tightly that I couldn't move. The blankets loosened, and I began to throw them off, and when they were off, I had every intent to run to my parents' room. But after getting the sheets off, I looked at my door and saw a shadow figure standing next to it, glowing red eyes fixated on me. Now, being a kid, obviously I screamed. If I couldn't go to my parents, then they were coming to me. But after I did, the shadow sort of mimicked the scream in a really creepy way and slapped me full send on my stomach. At that, I woke up with a furious jolt. To be honest, too, after catching my breath, I thought that it was just a nightmare, all in my head. However, I suddenly noticed a sort of burning sensation on my stomach, and I lifted up my shirt to see a bright red hand mark. There was no doubt that it was a hand mark. I mean, it looked exactly like a hand. I screamed once more, and I heard my parents this time practically kick the door down and run to my room. They all saw it too, the hand mark, and we still talk about it to this day, with no clue about who or what it was. I have slowly pieced more info about my old home's history and deaths together, and I'd be happy to share that sometime, but let's just say that there was something weird going on in that house. Anyway, thanks for listening. It was the summer right after I graduated from high school. A good friend and I decided to try our hand at camping. We grew up in the greater Los Angeles area, so our knowledge of the great outdoors was nothing beyond the couple of years that we had in Cub Scouts of America when we were in elementary school. In other words, we had almost no idea what we were doing. But we packed a tent, a couple of sleeping bags, supplies, etc., and headed off in his car. Note well, too, that I grew up in the 80s, so this is a time before the wide prevalence of cell phones and the existence of other portable and digital devices. But we drove north on the 395 for about 6 hours, and then headed westward into the mountains in the area of Inyo Canyon. The first mistake, too, was that we actually didn't plan on which place to camp. We just played it by ear, i.e. like fools. The second mistake, we left in mid-afternoon, and it was pitch black darkness when we arrived in the general area. We had driven off the main road and onto a dirt road in order to find a spot to camp. The dust from driving on the dirt road overwhelmed the headlight high beams when we finally decided to pull over and set up camp. It was around 11:30 around this time, and we were exhausted and definitely famished. Any place was a good spot to camp for us, given our only reason to do so at that point was our hunger and exhaustion. Third mistake, we forgot to bring flashlights. We only had BIC lighters for our cigarettes, and that was it. But we tried to set up the camp using our lighters and the headlights of the car, which was parked about 10 to 15 feet away. The wind was blowing, so the lighter constantly went out after a few seconds, either directly because of the wind, or indirectly because the wind would push the flame into our thumb. Clearly, we were being complete idiots. But eventually, we finally finished setting up the tent, but at that point I was just too tired to even eat. My friend eventually managed to make some instant ramen. We smoked a cigarette in the car, and then we just crashed out in the tent. But we awoke to a very cold morning. It must have been around 5:30, and immediately upon exiting the tent, we realized that we were camped at the entrance of a hiking trail. There were at least 2 no camping signs in visible distance from us, so we quickly dismantled the tent, cleaned up, and we cleared out. That morning, we ended up buying some cheap flashlights and a nice hot meal in a very small town. If I'm being honest though, it wasn't really a town, but more like a few storefronts and shops on a main road, about the length of an average city block. We went into some office, though I don't really recall exactly what it was. It might have been a park ranger station or the office headquarters for a campground. In any case, we found and reserved a site for that night. The campground was basically like a large circle with campsites along its outer circumference, with each campsite being about 50 yards from its neighbor. In the middle of the circle was a common bathroom and a shower. We circled around it once, and I think we saw one family that was all set up with a tent and a camper. We found our spot and we set up camp, which was quite far from them. And that night was when we had our creepy encounter. So, my friend and I were laying in the tent, just shining our flashlights upwards and chatting. Our new flashlights eventually gave out. Yes, they were broken. Our fire pit was about 6 feet from the opening of our tent, and it was just a sort of glowing ember by this point. We probably should have completely put it out, I know, and we probably shouldn't have had the tent so close. But in any case, there we were, just sort of chatting away and having a good time. My friend began to be distracted with his foot, and after the 3rd or 4th time, He got up to check his foot. I asked him what was wrong, and he told me that something is tapping his foot from outside of the tent. His foot was against the side of the tent, so from the outside you would have been able to see a bulge in the tent side where his foot was. It was as if pebbles were being thrown at his foot through the tent or something. Look, man, there it is again. What the heck? Each time it happened, there was a sound like pebbles or a light tap. We sort of laughed it off, assuming that it was a twig or a grass moving in the wind, or perhaps a loose strap on the outside of the tent. I don't recall exactly how it happened at first, but I do remember we suddenly became silent at the same time, because a sound came to be audible to both of us. Footsteps, slowly moving towards our tent. We wondered if it was a bear or some other non-human animal, but it seemed distinctly bipedal. They were very slow and measured, like a step every 2 seconds. I finally said in a whisper, "Someone's coming." My friend didn't move. His face had an expression of fear. At some point, my friend bolted up and said, "Screw this." He grabbed his pipe, stuffed it full of pot, and took the biggest, deepest drag that I've ever seen a person take. About a minute or two later, he was out. Weed isn't really my thing, so I was alone in the tent as far as conscious bodies are concerned. I was sitting up at this point, and I had taken out the only weapon that I had, a Swiss Army pocket knife. I took out the big and the small blades, as well as the ice pick in the middle, and held it like some ridiculous melee weapon. I could see the glowing embers in the fire pit through the sheer nylon material of our tent, and I was able to roughly but barely discern some of the rocks around it. I watched and listened intently. The footsteps came closer and at the same slow pace. With each step, I could hear the dirt and the rocks underfoot crunching and grinding. At some point it was clear to me, too, that whoever it was standing between the tent and the fire pit, because my fuzzy line of sight to the burning embers through the nylon tent became obscured by something outside of it. The footsteps stopped right at the front of the tent, about 6 to 8 inches from the entrance of the tent. It was silent for about 1 minute, and then I heard a click. At exactly the same time, I clearly saw through the nylon tent wall a flashlight turn on. I was able to see not just the flashlight though, but the outline of the hand holding it. The flashlight was shining on the zipper entrance into the tent, just inches from the zipper, and the blood instantly drained out of my head and my palms became dripping in sweat. I yelled, "Who's there?" There was some fear in my voice, but it was mostly aggressive in tone. Whoever it was, the person immediately turned off their flashlight. I didn't move, but neither did they. The person just stood there inches from the tent's only entrance. My friend is out, totally unaware of what's going on. Nevertheless, I pretend that he was still awake and whispered just loud enough to be audible to our visitor. "Yeah, it's loaded. There's one in the chamber," as if my friend was awake and asked me about our gun. The fourth mistake, though, was that we didn't actually have a gun or any real weapon for self-defense. It felt like an eternity too, but after sitting still for at least 10 minutes, I heard feet slowly turning in the dirt, then slowly walking away from the tent. I stayed up the whole night that night, and it wasn't until the light of dawn came through the tent that the heat inside the tent woke us up, and it was near noon by this point. We went outside to inspect the site, but we found nothing missing. However, we did find footprints leading away from our campsite and outside the campground. And I can assure you that that was the last time that I ever camped in a tent. When I was in college, I got a job delivering pizza late at night. Typically, I would work until about 2 in the morning. It was a pretty terrible job, I admit, and the shop was extremely dirty, unsanitary, and falling apart, but I typically made really good tips, so it was sort of worth it. I was 19 at the time, female, and it's summertime in CO, so even at night it's still fairly warm. Important details for later. So this is my second weekend on the job. I was still getting used to it, and I'm already a bit paranoid as a person, so I preferred just dropping off the pizza, taking my tip, and then leaving right away for the next delivery. I pretty much never went inside the person's house, and if I did, I would just step inside real quick, but leave the door open. Now, it was pretty close to midnight when I got a delivery to a house on the east side of town. It was supposed to be my last delivery of the night. I pulled up to the house, and it looked pretty normal from the outside. The street was really dark, but I didn't feel uncomfortable or anything, so I walked up to the door and knocked. This big shirtless old dude with a beer belly answers the door and tells me to come inside, and instantly I got weird vibes from him off the bat. I declined to come in and tried to just give him the pizza right there, but then he goes, "Come inside, it's freezing out and we don't want the cold air coming in." This didn't make sense to me as it was summer, but I stupidly get nervous and I take one step inside the house, not going all the way in though. But then he goes, "No, come all the way in, it's cold out." I know that I should have left at this point, but I was freaking out, not thinking straight, so I went in and he closed both the screen door and the main door behind me. I'm trying to calm myself down, telling myself that I'm just overreacting. He then tells his wife that the pizza's here. I can see her in the kitchen cooking, which seemed weird that she ordered pizza but was also cooking. I don't know. People do weird things. I look around the living room and it's filled to the brim with stuffed animals, completely covering the couches, tables, windowsills, everything, and it just gave me a really weird vibe. Then his wife comes into the living room holding something outstretched in her hand. She walks up to me and I see that it's some kind of bread or cake, and she goes, "Eat this banana bread, and don't worry, it's not poisonous." And what the heck, right? I try to politely decline, lying and saying that I'm on a diet. She just stares at me, still with her hand outstretched, waiting for me to take the bread. I don't take it, and then she gets really upset and starts yelling at me to eat the bread. I decline again, but this time I'm not trying to be polite, and I tell the couple that I really better get going back to work. I'm still holding the pizza too and thinking about just running out the door at this point. But she gives up on trying to make me eat this bread and walks back into the kitchen. Then the man is like, "Let me find some change for your tip." And he starts looking all around the living room, digging through the couch cushions, trying to find change to give me. I tell him to forget about it and that I don't need the tip, that he can just take the pizza, but he insists on finding a tip for me. He spends the next several minutes searching his stuffed animal-infested living room for change, and I start to think to myself that I think they're trying to stall me here. Most people have the tip ready when I get to their house, you see, so this was really weird. I was so worked up at this point too that I just tell the dude that I'm leaving and I start to open the door. He took his pizza and gave me a few quarters that he found, and I booked it out of there and went back to the shop. I told my supervisor when I got back what happened, and he didn't seem to care one bit. He just sent me on another delivery, and that was that. I was pretty ticked off by that, but I don't know. If that couple was actually creepy, or maybe they were just socially awkward, and I don't know what the heck was going on, but luckily I never delivered to that house again, which I'm very thankful for. I've decided to tell this story today because I know a lot of people have had similar experiences with weird or creepy host families, and know just how uncomfortable and awkward it is. This is a tad bit lengthy, but here it goes. So basically, some of my classmates in high school and I, along with some teachers, we went on a month-long trip around Europe to study, and as we only spent 1 week in each city, we stayed with host families for the most part. The trip had been going amazing too. My friend and I, who had chosen to stay together in our accommodation, had had a really good experience with an old lady that we stayed with the first part of the trip, so we were really excited to meet our next hosts. We had been encouraged to write an email to each of our hosts a week before we left home, just so that they could get to know us and we could get to know them, which helped making our first interactions not as awkward. However, I had sent a really nice email to the father of this family. His name is John, and he just never really replied. I didn't think much of it. He probably hadn't seen it, or maybe he just didn't want to answer, which is totally valid, I suppose. But just when we got off the plane, I got an email from him which merely said, "Hello, let me know when you get on the bus." I thought it was a bit cold, but I do tend to be a bit overly friendly sometimes, as a result of being extremely socially awkward, so I figured it was probably just me being too intense or something. The cab took us to their house, and we were greeted with the strongest glare that I had ever experienced. Again, me being overly friendly, I just sort of kept saying hi and thanking him for everything and whatnot, but he didn't even say anything. He just kept glaring at us and then at the taxi driver until the cab left and he just opened the door and let us inside. Before he even said hi or even showed us around the house or anything, he made us stay in the narrow entrance and began telling us the rules of the house, which is normal, I suppose, but the way that he said it was very intimidating. Basically stating that we had to take extreme care of his house or we'd have to pay for anything and everything that we damaged, which, again, valid I suppose, but he didn't stop glaring at us like we had already broken something. He ordered us to take our shoes off and told us our room was on the 3rd floor, then he left, and so we had to carry our suitcases up the very, very tiny and narrow stairs, not even knowing where we were going because we obviously didn't know the house and he hadn't even showed us the way, but whatever, we thought. It's probably just the awkward introduction. But the awkwardness had only just started, to be honest. You see, we were called down for dinner and we sat waiting whilst he cooked for us and his daughters. He asked us which one of us was vegetarian. That's me. And after explaining how stupid and unhealthy I was for not eating meat, and how being a vegetarian would take 10 years off your life, he handed me a little bowl of literally 5 pieces of very small lettuce leaves. Again, kind of awkward, I know, but we wouldn't even have dinner at their house since the school that we were exchanging into covered our meals, something I'm still so glad about too. So, in the end, it was fine. He started asking some really specific private questions, though, like, how much money have you brought? Where do you keep it so you don't lose it? And do you come from rich families? Which made us very uncomfortable, to say the least. So we just said we didn't know and tried to change the subject. He also ordered us to never speak Spanish, our mother tongue, whenever we were there, even if we were alone, inside or outside the house, which obviously we didn't do because, well, we speak Spanish. It's not like we have trouble speaking English or anything, but it was just ridiculous when we were literally talking alone. But whenever he would hear us talking in Spanish in our room, which I still don't know how he did, he'd come up and scold us for not conversing in English. Yes, he actually scolded us for not speaking in English. We also later learned too that his wife suffered from a disease. I'm not going to go into detail about that for privacy reasons, but we didn't see her around much, which might explain it. But that night, my friend took a shower first, then me, and whilst I was getting dressed in the bathroom, he came into our rooms and started talking to us and asking us other questions about us. It was really uncomfortable too because, well, like I said, I was still in the bathroom and he kept coming near the door to ask me stuff and then turning back to talk to my friend. But after a while, he left, thankfully, and it was fine. But it was at this stage that we discussed that it was really weird and we were really worried about the money questions because it was his own house and he could easily just come in the room in the middle of the night, open our suitcases and do whatever he wanted. So, the next morning we got up really early and came down for breakfast. To be honest too, I think we kind of had high expectations because of our last host and how they were just the absolute best. So, we were expecting that he would, at the very least, have a slice of bread for us or something. And yeah, he didn't. But that's not the bad part too. You see, whilst the whole family was eating at the table, he told us to go up and go through all the cabinets in the pantry, that there would surely be something to eat there. I honestly didn't feel comfortable with raiding through his family's kitchen while they were there just staring at me. My friend grabbed a banana at some stage because she didn't know what to do, and I said that I wasn't hungry, so in the end we just left and decided to no longer have breakfast at their house because it was just too awkward. And I know you must be thinking that I'm overreacting, but first of all, I didn't know these people, and it was so uncomfortable. Besides, my social anxiety, that didn't help at all too, and I just couldn't bear being there anymore. As I said though, since we had dinner at school, we didn't really spend a lot of time with them, so we really only showered there and slept there, and that was pretty much it. But somehow, in the little time that we were at that house, he always found a way to make us feel more and more out of place. Like, we had to let him know via text when we were coming home, and I'd always be polite but also friendly, so I would just say, "Hi John, we're 5 minutes away." Always with a little exclamation mark to seem nice, I guess. But the second night we arrived home, and as we went through the front door, he came stomping his way towards us, absolutely furious, like he was about to punch a wall, and he started yelling at me, telling me to never ever text him or any adult like that again. I was so incredibly confused and scared, like, what did I even send him? He pulled out his phone and made me read out loud that message. He said normal people do not text like that it was very disrespectful, and proceeded to show the text to everyone around the house and asking them what they thought of this, and if anyone had ever texted them like this, and he was so angry about an exclamation mark. I was livid inside, absolutely at the verge of tears and at the point of leaving the house, and in the end, I just said sorry and went to our room. He then came up smiling like nothing had happened and had the absolute audacity to ask, "Have you brought any gifts for us?" We had, mind you, we had brought them a beautiful picture frame and lots of sweets from our country. We had spent a lot of money on them too, and we handed it out to them. He was acting like a little kid at Christmas, but when he opened them, he looked at them like we had given him a bag of trash. "This is it?" he asked, frowning. I thought it was going to be something better. I figured, since we're letting you stay in our home. But I guess it's fine. Thanks. And then he left the room disappointed. We continued to have really, really bad encounters with him, telling us off like we were his daughters that he could yell at like it was nothing. At night, we'd hear screaming, fighting, banging and crying, and my friend wanted to contact accommodation services to ask for a host switch because we were truly having a really horrible time at this point, running away from our host to avoid another interaction, but I refused to. I know, pretty dumb. Because, firstly, I was too shy and scared of what could happen when we told him that we were leaving for another home, and also, I felt really, really bad because of his wife. And I didn't want to give the family a hard time when they were probably already struggling with medical care and hosting was their only income. She was mad at him for a bit, but she thought the same as I did. As badly as we wanted to leave, we didn't think that it was right, so we decided to just suck it up, get it over with, and be on our way. We also had gotten lost at some point while we were on the night bus back home at one point. Luckily, there was a teacher from the school who we knew, and she walked us home. And she asked who we were staying with, and we told her that we were staying with John, and mentioned that it was a bit uncomfortable there. And her face changed a little bit from happy to kind of worried. "Yeah, I know him. We've been told that he's a bit special, but that's it really. I wouldn't worry about it too much, but just be careful, okay? Yeah. Try to spend a night in that madhouse and you might come up with a different opinion." Anyway, when we told John about us getting lost and the teacher helping us, he seemed so interested in a sort of creepy way. He said that he knew her too and asked us how she was. And the creepiest part was that he asked us if we knew where she lived, like at least 2 or 3 times as well. We had seen her house, but we decided to tell him no because it was super weird. The last full day there too, he had told us that he probably wouldn't be home when we arrived, since he mentioned that he was meeting a friend or something, but that he would arrive no longer than 10 minutes after we did. We arrived home that night, and as he'd said, he wasn't home. This time, the only one home was his wife. and it was our first time getting to chat with her only. She was surprisingly nice too. She seemed genuinely like the only sane person in this house, and we talked for a while actually, and then we thanked her profusely for everything, even though her husband is our nightmare, and told her that she had a very beautiful family. Then she stopped smiling and said, "You think so? I don't think so," and laughed. "But thank you." And then it was just this awkward sort of silence for a moment. For about 30 seconds, I think, in fact. Neither of us knew what to say to respond to that, so after a bit we just sort of nervously laughed and said goodnight and went to bed. John didn't return until almost midnight that night. He asked us if we had any laundry to do. I did. Some of the clothes I'd been wearing for a week and really needed to be washed. But then he said that he would do it, and wouldn't let me go and help or do it myself. And honestly, this might be a stretch, but I really didn't want to give him my clothes for some reason. It just felt wrong. So I ended up declining, saying that I remembered that I actually had washed them, which I knew wasn't believable, but there was no way that I was about to give him my stuff. He kept insisting, asking over and over again if I was sure, and I said that I was. The next morning, we were really excited to finally be able to leave that house after a week that felt honestly like a month. We had our things ready, and we took our stuff down the stairs to the main entrance, waiting for the cab to pick us up. Then he came downstairs and started to sort of make small talk with us. He kept looking at the window over and over again, like he was looking for something. We thanked him for the hospitality, which wasn't provided, but you gotta be polite, I guess. And he started rambling about how he loved hosting students, that he'd been doing this for like 10 years and stuff like that. And then he started saying weird stuff like, "But you have to be careful because you don't know who you could be staying with. There's some crazy people out there, you know." And I swear to you that I was about to escape, getting ready to run, and then the cab arrived, finally, and he started suddenly acting super nice and happy, like we had the greatest relationship. He hugged my friend, and then he went to hug me. I sort of reluctantly hugged him back for a second, and then we went out the door. As soon as I stepped out of that house, he slammed the door shut so loudly, even the cab driver looked scared. He glared at us through the little window while we got in the cab and drove off, and I've never been so relieved in my life to leave a place. It was honestly like a huge weight being pulled off my shoulders. And you can bet that I blocked that number so quickly, glad that I would never have to see them again in my life. Now, I understand that families have their issues, but that man was absolutely terrifying. Even though I'm really thankful